All right, welcome everyone. My name is Jesse Stife and I'm the president of the Reading League Florida. We are super excited to bring you tonight's session, 40 years of reading intervention research for elementary students with or at risk of dyslexia. So we have just a couple of short announcements before we get into the content of tonight's webinar. So I want to encourage everyone to keep up with the Reading League Florida on our various websites. The main way that we communicate with folks is through social media. You can find us on Facebook at the Reading League Florida or at TRLFL. We're always disseminating, high quality resources that are directly applicable for teachers and other stakeholders. So please follow us on Facebook and on Twitter if you're so inclined. You can also find us at fl.thereadingleague.org. And while you're on our pages, I'd like to encourage everyone to consider joining us as members or making a donation. Your membership helps us kind of keep the lights on here and keep the free high quality PD coming. So we are an all volunteer 501c3 organization. And so this is only a labor of love that the folks at the Reading League Florida do for free in our spare time. And everyone, or every penny from membership and donations goes right back into the organization for things like our insurance and other logistics. So our aim is to keep all of our content free and publicly available, since we never want money to be a barrier for professional development for teachers. So for tonight's webinar, we've opened up the Q&A function, and we welcome our live participants here to ask questions during the presentation. Our presenters will be taking some of those questions at the end of the session here, but please remember to just use the Q&A to ask questions and not to make general comments, since it just makes things a bit more difficult for us to work through all those entries. All right, so lastly, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hall and her team. Dr. Colby Hall is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia's School of Education and Human Development. Her research focuses on a number of things like the components of effective literacy instruction for elementary and middle school students with or at risk for literacy difficulties, inference instruction as a means of improving comprehension, reading instruction for bilingual and multilingual students with reading difficulties, instruction supporting text comprehension in content area classrooms, and a wide variety of other topics. She's authored a number of peer-reviewed publications in a wide variety of academic journals, and her work has been very helpful and very influential for us here at the Reading League Florida, as I hope it has been for many of you out there. So thank you, Dr. Hall, for joining us, and team, and I will kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and it's such a privilege to be able to talk with all of you. I wanted to quickly introduce, actually maybe I'll wait and introduce Karen and Caitlin when I start the presentation, because I have a little slide with all of our faces on it, but I'll share my screen now and then I can do that. Okay, does that work? Okay, great. So the title, you all probably know the title of our talk today, the topic is Reading Intervention Research for Elementary Students with or at Risk for Dyslexia. You already know me. Karen Kehoe is a postdoctoral research associate at UVA, and she's working on the Virginia Literacy Partnerships branch of our work. It's actually really exciting work. I wish I had more time to talk about it. But Karen and Caitlin encouraged me to do a quick introduction of both of them. Caitlin is a doctoral student at UVA. She's in her second year. And we all worked together. I should also say about Caitlin that she was just awarded the 30 Under 30 International Literacy Association Award. I actually had on a different screen that I can't find now a description of the award, but I think it says it recognizes visionaries, innovators, disruptors in the field, teachers, as well as advocates, as well as researchers. So it's really exciting that she got that award. Okay, so today first I'll define some key terms. Then I will present a systematic review. I will say that Karen and Caitlin were on the research team that conducted systematic review 1. And then Karen, along with Emily Solari was the lead author and Karen was the second author, but they led the team that conducted this second systematic review. So Karen will describe the results of that review. And then Caitlin will synthesize findings across the 2 reviews. And then we'll have time to talk about some limitations and some questions and areas for future research at the end. Okay, so when we discuss these systematic reviews, we just wanted to define a few key terms to make sure we all sort of have a common understanding of them, because they're terms that are used very commonly in, within these systematic reviews. The first is just the term systematic review to begin with. When I talk about a systematic review, I just mean a study in which researchers systematically review the relevant research on a specific topic for the purpose of creating generalizations. So, they'll use a predetermined search strategy that tries to get at all of the research out there on a given topic. They'll search methodically a set of databases using a comprehensive set of search terms that will allow them to get at all of the research out there. And then they'll use a systematic approach to coding and analyzing those, the studies that they identify. Within that sort of umbrella systematic review construct, there are 2 different, and I should say that many people would talk about lots of different types of systematic reviews, but I think there are 2 big types, and there are 2 types that we'll talk about today. One is a meta-analysis, and the other is a descriptive synthesis. So first, I'll present the results of a meta-analysis, and second, the paper that Karen will present is a descriptive synthesis. So a meta-analysis is just a kind of systematic review that uses statistical techniques to combine findings across several different studies. I like this photo, and I should say I stole some of these slides from Karen, so she gets credit for a lot of the images on them. But I like this little image of a brain thinking about a brain as an image for metacognitive, right? So we use that term metacognitive maybe more frequently than we use the term meta-analysis, but the meanings are similar, right? With a meta-analysis, with the term metacognitive, the brain is thinking about the process of thinking, right? And in a meta-analysis, you're doing an analysis of other analyses. Okay, so another key term is just the idea of inclusion and exclusion criteria, which is central to any systematic review. So it's really important when you're conducting a systematic review to compare apples to apples or oranges to oranges. This is because when you're calculating a mean effect across a whole bunch of studies, which is what you're doing in a meta-analysis, this information is only going to be useful if people can use it to generalize about the effects of a particular type of intervention or an intervention for a particular population, for example. So I think an example is helpful. Like if you have X type of intervention that's really effective and Y type of intervention that is actually harmful, it's less effective than the alternative. But then you combined those all together, you mushed them together in a meta-analysis, then the average effect of those 2 would be about nothing, right? We would learn that the intervention didn't help and it didn't hurt, right? But that won't give us a lot of information about either X type of intervention or Y type of intervention, right? We lose a lot by trying to mush together things that are really different. So the idea of these inclusion and exclusion criteria are to, try to identify apples and only apples. And the criteria that we, I might even just let this all, okay, good. When we're establishing inclusion and exclusion criteria, we usually address these 5 things, which are represented by this PICOS acronym. You identify the population that you're interested in, the type of intervention that you're interested in, the comparison group, the allowable comparison group. And you can imagine that the comparison group is really important, right? Because if you included studies that say where there were two conditions, one condition was 40 hours of a really great intervention, and the other was 20 hours of the same really great intervention. And then we were looking at what the effects were, you know, at the end, how much students grew. Then the difference would be really different than if you looked at 40 hours or 40 weeks, I forget what our unit was, of that amazing intervention versus nothing, right? And so it's important that you have in these studies kind of relatively similar comparison conditions. You also want to define your outcomes that you're interested in, and then the allowable study designs. So those are usually the things that our inclusion criteria will address. So I think those were all of sort of the key terms that I wanted to define first. And now I'm going to jump into presenting on the meta-analysis that we did of 40 years of research on interventions for K-5 students with or at risk for dyslexia. And we can share this article with anyone who's interested. I'm sure I can, you know, send it to Jesse, and we can make sure we make it available. So I think one important question to answer, you know, when I'm trying to explain why we did this meta-analysis is, you know, when there are so many other meta-analyses out there on the topic of reading instruction for students with reading difficulties, why do another one? And I think the answer is here. When we were studying all of these previous meta-analyses that had been done relatively recently, and they all described their populations of interest. And we realized that they were always really pretty broad and inclusive when they defined their population of interest. In some studies, the only, you know, in the first one, they just say disadvantaged students. In some others, they talk about students in the lowest half of their class, or in the lowest, you know, below the 40th percentile. In some, like the ones that get all 2016 meta-analysis, they include students who are from low-income communities, or you know, who are eligible to receive free and reduced price lunch. And in many studies, they include students with language difficulties, you know, like specific language impairment, as well as students with reading difficulties. And many, they include students with language comprehension difficulties, you know, reading difficulties that are caused by language comprehension difficulties, as well as reading difficulties that are, you know, as well as word reading and spelling difficulties, which we describe as dyslexia in this study. So we were really interested in finding out what were the mean effects. I'll get to the research questions in a second, but so we were interested in finding out what are the effects of reading interventions on reading outcomes for students who had or were at risk for significant word level reading difficulties. And then we were also interested in looking at outcomes on norm referenced measures of word reading, spelling, or skills foundational to word reading or spelling. So these were our research questions. And I think, you know, I've already sort of talked about the first big question in a meta-analysis is usually, what is the mean effect of all of the studies that are out there looking at the effects of reading interventions on outcomes for this population? What is the mean effect? Are they effective on average? And then the second question that we asked was about moderators of intervention effects. Are there characteristics of participants that are associated with intervention effectiveness? Are there certain types of interventions that tend to be more effective? Are there measures that students who receive such interventions typically do, make the most gains on particular types of measures versus others? And then are there sort of study characteristics that are associated with effect sizes? So we wanted to ask those types of questions too. And to talk about our inclusion criteria, which I tried to organize sort of in that PICOS order. The population one, we've already discussed, but participating students needed to perform at or below our designated norm referenced threshold. And I should say, I think I have in a previous slide here what our threshold was. I should remember this, but I'm going to read it from the slide. So, and it's in my notes, I'll say, not on the slides, just so you don't think you're missing anything. We define our norm referenced threshold here was a screening threshold of performance at or below the 25th percentile on a measure of word reading, spelling, or skills foundational to word reading and spelling, or reported mean baseline, like at pretest before kids got the intervention, mean baseline performance at or below the 16th percentile. So that was our population. And then in terms of interventions, we just required that they take place in a school setting because we really wanted to generalize. We wanted to help teachers know what would be effective in classrooms. So we wanted the interventions to take place in a school setting, to include a foundational skills component, meaning word reading, spelling, or like PA and phonics instruction that would be helpful for word reading and spelling. And then we also required that interventions be provided in English. The comparison group needed to be receiving business as usual reading instruction or some type of instruction without a foundational skills / word or text reading component. So in some studies, it was a researcher delivered comparison, but it would be like math instruction or music instruction. And very rarely it would be a researcher delivered comparison condition that would be just focused on, let's say, reading comprehension, but it wouldn't involve any word reading or spelling instruction. Outcomes needed to include phonological awareness, knowledge of grapheme phoneme correspondences, real or pseudo word reading, spelling, or passage reading. And then we only looked in this meta-analysis on at the effects of experimental or quasi-experimental group design studies. I won't, this is way too tiny for anyone to see, I'm sure, and it's not super important. It just represents our systematic search process. And the important thing is in that little box at the end that is next to the included blue bubble, we identified 52 studies altogether that met these inclusion criteria that we included. So I'm going to jump right to our findings, but anyone, feel free to ask me more questions about our methods at the end. So our big main finding was that on average, there were significant positive effects of these included interventions that were studied in the 52 studies we included on norm referenced reading outcomes with an effect size of the Hedges G of 0.33 for students in our population, students with or at risk for dyslexia. And that's important. Caitlin will talk at the end about kind of how to interpret effect sizes. So I'll let her do that, but the 0.33 is not shabby. That's a meaningful, a practically significant effect size. And we can, this finding shows us that reading interventions that have been evaluated in research studies really do work on average to meaningfully improve outcomes for students with or at risk for dyslexia. So takeaway from that is, yes, we should be providing elementary grade students with or at risk for dyslexia with, interventions of the type that were included in the meta-analysis. And then I think it's just important to say that intervention is particularly important for our students with or at risk for dyslexia, given the prevalence of core curricula that don't adequately incorporate evidence-based phonics and word reading instruction in the early grades. I think I won't say anything more about that, but I think that probably everyone who's listening would agree with that. And it's not in every school, right? There are lots of schools that have evidence-based core instruction, but many don't. So I think it's useful to talk a little bit about what included interventions looked like. All of them provided word reading instruction, and we didn't require them to. So I don't know if you remember, but in our inclusion criteria, we required that they provided word reading, spelling, or instruction and skills foundational to word reading or spelling, like PA. But we didn't have any interventions that met our other inclusion criteria that were all PA, let's say, or all spelling. So all of them provided word reading instruction. All but one of those taught students to read words using knowledge of grapheme phoneme correspondences and decoding. So there was only one that just kind of taught students to read words by rote. Most of them did not, the vast majority, 51 of them did. 71% of included interventions also included a phonological awareness component. 73% also involved spelling instruction, and 87% included connected text reading opportunities. 20% included instruction in morphology, 41% in vocabulary, and 50% in reading comprehension. So they were really mostly multi-component interventions. It was more rare for interventions to be just word reading instruction than it was for interventions to incorporate other components, and many of them had sort of language comprehension focused components as well. Most interventions were delivered to small groups of students, but some were implemented one-on-one. And then only 7% of the interventions were described as using a multisensory approach. I don't know if I have a later slide on this, but I think it's worth explaining that when we coded interventions as being multisensory or not multisensory, we went back and forth about the best way to do that. And in the end, we just decided that it was simplest to say if the intervention was marketed as multisensory. So if it was described as a multisensory intervention in the article, then we called it multisensory. If it wasn't, then it wasn't multisensory, because it was too hard to kind of parse the short description of the intervention that's provided in the article to kind of make that judgment on our own confidently that a given intervention was multisensory or not multisensory, according to our definition. All right, so the second, big question we asked was, were there any characteristics of participants, interventions, measures, or studies that were associated with effects? And there were two statistically significant moderators, so variables that statistically significantly were associated with intervention effects. When we did this kind of more rigorous multiple moderator, multiple meta regression. And one of them was dosage. So intervention dosage was associated with accelerated reading development. And the word dosage always sort of connotes medicine to me. I think about like the dosage of a medicine, but in this case, dosage meant hours of instruction. So each additional hour of intervention led to a small improvement in reading scores relative to the comparison group. And I should say it was a small improvement for each additional hour, but you can imagine that those hours add up, right? So the more hours you can provide, the gains start to increase. The other thing that mattered in terms of intervention effects was reading outcomes. So interventions had a stronger effect on phonological awareness and word reading / spelling outcomes than they did on reading comprehension or text reading outcomes. So this is not a surprising finding. There have been other meta-analyses that have found the same thing. And I think what it really suggests is that it's easier to move the needle on students' foundational skills than on the more complex set of skills that comprise reading comprehension. And then the other thing to consider is that our inclusion criteria required that interventions focus on foundational skills in word reading and spelling. They didn't require that there was a comprehension focus. So maybe it's not surprising that the interventions that were included had a stronger effect on these foundational skills and word reading and spelling outcomes. We asked this question that we were really interested in about whether intervention components mattered. And I should say that, this was the question we were really interested in. We had 52 studies. Usually kind of a rule of thumb is that you need at least 50 studies. I don't know if this rule of thumb is changing or if it's just one I have in my mind, but I think of this rule of thumb of 50 studies. You kind of have to have 50 studies in order to do these moderator analyses. And we did have that, but I do think it's still important to realize that our analyses here, these moderator analyses, were underpowered. So it would be great to have more studies in order to really feel confident that we, I think that there may be effects of like intervention component that we weren't able to discover because we just didn't have the bulk of studies that we needed to ask these questions. But that said, to remind you, all interventions included word reading instruction, and we wanted to ask at whether it was beneficial to students when the interventions also had morphology or vocabulary instruction. We kind of lumped all those studies together. Whether it was helpful if there was word reading instruction plus spelling instruction or encoding instruction. And whether it was helpful when there was a standalone, like a separate PA instructional component in addition to word reading instruction. We did not find any statistically significant impacts in this multiple moderator model that we used. I will say that we also did some single moderator analyses, partly because we just previous meta-analyses have used this single moderator analysis approach, and we wanted to kind of be able to speak to those previous meta-analyses. We were just curious about how comparable our results would be to theirs. So we did also run the analyses in that way. And the single moderator analysis indicated that it was beneficial to incorporate spelling instruction into reading interventions for students with dyslexia, which corroborates a finding reported by Gersten et al. In a 2020 meta that they did. And their meta was focused on students with reading difficulties broadly defined, not students with dyslexia. But it was interesting that they also found that there was promise for interventions that include spelling as well as word reading. I think there's really a need for more research on this topic, whether it's beneficial to add that. And when there's more research, then we can do a better powered moderator analysis on this topic. In terms of this question, do students with dyslexia need multisensory instruction? So were the effects of interventions that you were described as multisensory different from the effects of interventions that were not? We did not see a difference. Again, this was a relatively underpowered analysis. There were only, I think I said 7, right, earlier. There were only 7 studies that were coded where the interventions were coded as multisensory. So it was underpowered. There's definitely a need for more research on this topic, but it's worth knowing that this meta-analysis doesn't provide evidence for the benefit of reading instructional programs that describe themselves as multisensory, over interventions that provides systematic, explicit instruction in word reading and spelling and foundational skills that are foundational in word reading and spelling, but don't describe themselves as multisensory. In terms of one-on-one, the effects of one-on-one interventions versus small group interventions, one-on-one interventions were not more effective than small group interventions. I do again think this is a topic, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, that's worthy of further research. I think it was interesting that Gersten et al. In their meta that I referred to earlier found that for certain grade levels of students, and for grade 1 in particular, effects were larger for one-on-one interventions. Once students got older in grade 2 or grade 3, it seemed as though small group was just as effective as one-on-one. But for those grade 1 students, it was helpful when instruction was one-on-one. So I think that, in a better powered meta-analysis, you could ask slightly more nuanced questions about the effects of one-on-one versus small group instruction for particular grade levels, that kind of thing. And I realize I'm taking a long time, Karen, I promise I'm going to try to get to you soon. The other question that we asked was, is it better to deliver intervention earlier rather than later? And again, the answer to that is that there weren't statistically significant differences for interventions that were delivered in grades K through 2 versus grades 3 through 5. But there were very few studies conducted with students in grades 3 through 5, which really kind of reduces your power to discover an effect. And you can see that descriptively speaking, the effect size that was associated with studies conducted with students in K through 2 was bigger, 0.36, than the mean effect of studies that were conducted with students in grades 3 through 5. So I do think it's worth just sharing those descriptive results, even if they were not statistically significant. And I do think that we can say that, interventions with an effect size of 0.33, even if they had that same effect size across grade levels, are more likely to close achievement gaps for kids in kindergarten or first grade than for children in grade 5, because reading difficulties tend to become more significant as children progress through the grades. And then also just sort of a moral ethical thing. We know that in the absence of intervention, children with or at risk for dyslexia are at risk for developing psychosocial or behavioral difficulties. So for all of these reasons, we encourage school districts to intervene early rather than late if they're faced with a decision about how to direct limited resources. So if there are all the resources in the world, then hopefully you intervene at all grade levels. But if there are limited resources, then we would recommend trying to intervene as early as possible. So how do our findings compare to those reported in previous reading metas? I may actually skip this because I know Caitlin is going to talk about this later. So I'll skip this and I can jump in later if there's anything additional I want to say, so that I can hand it off to Karen, who will present on the systematic review that she worked on.
Great, thanks, Colby. And yes, I will say that we initially called this a synthesis of the research, and we thought it was going to be a descriptive synthesis. As Colby kind of explained, there's this research synthesis or systematic review umbrella, and then you can have a descriptive synthesis, or you can have a meta-analysis, or both. And so we didn't think we were going to have enough power to be able to do a meta-analysis, but we actually did meta-analyze the studies, the effects of the study, so that we did come up with a mean effect. But just with that caveat, we did have a much smaller group of studies to work with. So and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So thank you. So here is here's the cover page of the article. It was effectiveness of interventions for English learners with word reading difficulties. Couple things about this is we use the term English learners, and I've kind of switched in my own language to saying emergent bilinguals because it sort of puts a little bit more of an emphasis on students' assets versus, what they haven't yet acquired, which is, English language proficiency. But the way that it's published is English learners. So when we talk about English learners, you might hear, or your state might use limited English proficient, English language learners, emergent bilingual. We're talking about the same population. And we were also intentional about using word reading difficulties versus dyslexia. And there are a few reasons for that I will get into a little bit more in the coming slides. But just kind of an overview is that we know that dyslexia is not it's not a you have it or you don't kind of situation, right? It's on that reading skills are on a continuum. And so at the very severe end of word reading difficulties, that's when we would consider a child to, yes, you may have a copy. I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat, but yes, we will provide copies of both of these studies. But so we know that dyslexia is when we consider children or even adults who have more severe deficits in word reading and spelling, but that it's on a continuum, right? So we're really talking about English learners who have specific word reading difficulties, maybe would not be categorized as dyslexia depending on the classification model, but that there is evidence that they do fall kind of on the lower end of the reading continuum in the word reading category. So just a couple clarifications about the terminology that we use here. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so why English learners? So as you probably can tell already, these two meta-analyses were very similar, but this one that I'm talking about now focus specifically on emergent bilinguals, on English learners. And why is that? Well, first, we know that this is a large and growing portion of the population, not just across the United States, right? Representing about 10.4% of K-12 US enrollment as of 2.5 years ago, but we also know that it's growing. And so I know here in Florida and where we are in Virginia, it is closer to that national average, but in some places like California and Texas, we're closer to 20%. And so this is a growing population. So it's not something that we can just kind of say like, oh, well, we can just think about students with dyslexia, and we don't have to single out emergent bilinguals, because if emergent bilinguals do have specific needs above and beyond sort of students for whom English is their first language, who also have word reading difficulties, then we need to be able to identify interventions that may be particularly effective for this population. Okay, and so then why, next slide, please. And so then why English learners? Oh, right. This is still just talking about how the population is growing. So we know it's at about 10% nationally, and that this population is growing. And within the next, 7 years, the Census Bureau estimates that we're going to have close to 40% of our school-age population who speak a language other than English as their first language. So one way to think about this is their home language maybe does not match the language of instruction in schools, right? Unless they are fortunate enough to go to a dual language school. And so we really need to be thinking about how is the language of instruction serving students in general who are learning English, but then also very specifically for students who are struggling with word reading with word reading difficulties in addition to learning the language of instruction. Okay, so now the next slide, please. So that's why English learners. So now why English learners with word reading difficulties specifically? And this speaks to the fact that if you're familiar with what we call the simple view of reading, I know this is something that we've been talking about a lot in the research community, and I think and I hope that it's starting to kind of trickle down into practitioners' kind of everyday language. But just at a quick overview, the simple view says that in order to be a proficient reader and to comprehend what you're reading, you need to be able to read the words, decode the words on the page, right? And then to be able to understand what the words mean when they're put together in sentences and paragraphs and in a text, right? So the two sides are decoding or word reading and listening comprehension. Right. And so those two things come together in fluent automatic word reading. And that is what, facilitates reading comprehension. And so, yeah, there we go. We have the little graphic. So this is the graphic that shows that, right? And you might also hear Scarborough's rope. That is something that also includes the simple view, but also includes specifically the component of fluency, right? That facilitate reading comprehension. If you could go back to the next slide, Colby, please. Thank you. And so we know that those skills that were just on that graphic, those are the same skills that English monolinguals, or students for whom the language of instruction is also their home language, and that English learners or emergent bilinguals, those two groups of students need the same skills to be able to comprehend written English. But that the students who are learning English as a second language and also have or at risk for dyslexia or word reading difficulties, those reading difficulties may be masked or may not be identified as readily because of their still developing oral language proficiency, right? So if they're struggling on their, benchmark assessments, or if you give the DIBELS, or if you give, any kind of easy CBM or anything like that, and their scoring may be low, practitioners may think, oh, well, that's just because they haven't learned the language yet. And that'll kind of work itself out as they develop their English proficiency. But what we know is that a child can be learning English and have dyslexia, right? And so we need to be able to make sure that we're assessing and instructing for all of the child's needs and for their strengths. And so with that, we know that there have really not been a ton of studies to study specifically English learners with word reading difficulties specifically. And so that's what we really wanted to look at with this meta-analysis, where if we didn't just say all English learners, but we said those English learners who are showing some risk factors for dyslexia or for word reading difficulties, and then there are some interventions for those students, what is the mean effect of those interventions for these students in particular? I had mentioned just sort of anecdotally that students that are learning English as a second language or a third language may be under-identified. And there's actually research that says in kindergarten and first grade, emergent bilinguals are under-identified for word reading problems, word reading difficulties, and tend to be served less often in special education. But then when you get to third grade and above, English learners tend to be overrepresented in special education, but still underrepresented as having dyslexia compared to English monolinguals. So it's a really complicated situation in which we still haven't really fully landed on the best way to be able to identify early English learners who have this specific challenge. Okay, so we also know that explicit systematic multi-component interventions have been found to be effective, but again, there haven't been so many studies. Colby mentioned that sort of standard of 50 studies. You're going to be a little bit surprised when you see the number of studies we were able to locate that focus specifically on English learners. But we know sort of from the few studies that are out there that multi-component interventions do seem to work, but we really wanted to know, okay, can we quantify that? And can we say, if we looked at really rigorous experimental studies, what can we say is the mean effect of these interventions? Okay, so now you can go, and we'll skip the simple view since I already kind of talked about that a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you. Just go to the next one. Oh, we have these little animations. I think these were supposed to come up when I was talking about them, but all right. So our research questions were very similar. We were interested again in the mean effect of these reading interventions that have a foundational skills component. Again, just like in the meta-analysis that Colby spoke about, we required that all studies that we included have that component of either word reading or phonemic awareness, spelling, something with a foundational skills component. They could have other components as well, and many did. For English learners with or at risk for word reading difficulties in K through 5. So again, there's that with or at risk for word reading difficulties. And I know that Colby had a very strict criterion that we applied as we were including studies. And so they had to be 25th percentile on a screening measure, or a mean of 16th percentile or below on the diagnostic. Here, because of that situation I just talked about, where English learners do tend to be under-identified for dyslexia, we didn't, and because there are so few studies, we really didn't want to miss out on any studies that had a really good design and served English learners learners, but maybe did not quantify in the same way what said that they were at risk for word reading difficulties. So just as some examples of the ways that we sort of qualified what word reading difficulties meant, if the teacher said, you know, I have this student who is really struggling with decoding. And so the teacher recommended that student for intervention. We went ahead and included it and said that participant is eligible to be included. If the parent brought their child to, you know, to the school and said, I'm reading with my child at home and he's really struggling both in Spanish and in English. He's struggling to read the words on the page, then that would be something that we would consider to be eligible in terms of the study for inclusion in this meta-analysis. So a little bit looser, but again, it's because of that under-identification issue that we see for emergent bilinguals. And then we also were interested in looking, just like with the other one, about whether or not effects varied by different characteristics of studies and participants. But unlike the last meta-analysis that you heard about, we were not really able to look at moderators very much at all, just because of how few studies we had. But that's a sort of a statistical issue that I won't get bogged down in right now. So those were our research questions. Go to the next slide. Okay, so we had, I think these, this is, if you can just like click on all of them. Okay, so, sorry. All right, so very similar to the last meta-analysis, and that one of the reasons is because we did take a subset of the studies that we used in the last one. And when Colby was talking about experimental or quasi-experimental studies, in the meta-analysis that she led, we really just looked at group design studies. And so that's like comparing, if we took two similar groups, and she talked about comparing apples to apples. So if we took two very similar groups of students, right, and said one gets the intervention and one doesn't, and then we compare their outcomes, that sort of that's what sort of makes it experimental or non-experimental, right? We can't just take two groups of students that are not similar at all and compare their outcomes. That's not going to be experimental. But if we have two very similar groups of students and we compare their outcomes, that's a group design study. In this meta-analysis, we also included another kind of experimental study, which is a single case. And that's when you have really, when you have either high incidence disabilities, low incidence disabilities like autism, or you have a specialized population like emergent bilinguals, and you can only maybe deliver an intervention to 1 to 3 students at a time, right? We don't want to lose those studies because we know that there are ways to make those studies really rigorous. And in that case, the student becomes their own control. And that's just a whole, that's a whole class that you can take on single case research if you're interested, but just know that there was an additional type of experimental study that we included in this meta-analysis because of the type of population that we were interested in asking these questions about. So again, I've already talked about our population. Our intervention was, again, interventions with a foundational skills component. And we can just kind of go through. And the exclusion criteria is just like, who did we not include? So we did not include kids in preschool or kids in middle school or high school. We did make the decision not to include kids with an intellectual disability or with autism spectrum disorder, just again, not because those are not important populations to study, for sure they are, but again, we really wanted to think about the traditional mainstream classroom, right? And interventions that the teacher may be implementing or reading specialist or what have you, sort of at that tier 2. So students that maybe do not have really intense kind of tier 3 needs or specialized needs like a child with autism. And so we wanted to make sure we were comparing apples to apples, right? So we did exclude kids with ASD or ID. Dosage, the interventions had to occur over more than one session, just like in Colby's. The instruction had to occur primarily in English, again, because we were interested in sort of that match or mismatch of the language of instruction. But here we did have a lot of studies in which the interventions included a second language component, or for the students, their first language component, right? But as long as it was 50% or more was in English, then that was a study that we can include. If the instruction was provided entirely in the student's native language, then we excluded it. Again, talked about decoding or foundational skills intervention. If everything else, met our inclusion criteria, but it was just an oral language intervention to, build students' English vocabulary, we did not include it because, again, we were focused on kids who were learning English and also showed signs of risk for dyslexia or word reading difficulties. And then our last I think we have a few more, had to be school-based. And there needed to be some kind of reading outcomes, right? We find a lot of like behavioral interventions that also have a reading component, but we needed the studies to have some type of reading outcome. We didn't include things that were focused primarily on writing, composition, or handwriting. And then I think we had one more inclusion criterion. Or is that it? Okay, all right. So this is, yep, that's good. Thanks. So this is our Prisma diagram, and Prisma just stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. And if it were not written right there, I probably would not remember that acronym. But so again, this is just sort of that systematic process of how can we be confident to say that we searched all the literature, right? This just kind of goes to show that there was a process, there was a method to our madness. We went and to all the databases that we had access to, right, to all of the academic journals. And that's why you see so many authors on these papers, right? It's not because we all like wrote a line of the study. It's because we all were involved in this culling of all of these studies and then looking and saying, okay, do the participants in this study meet the inclusion criteria? Does this have the right type of outcome? And we had to look through 16,000 some studies to finally get down to just 17 studies, right? Which is like kind of anticlimactic. We looked at 16,395 studies, and then we came up with 17. But that is just to show you that we really needed to apply our very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria so that we could be very confident that we were comparing like studies and with like students so that we could come up with a mean effect that meant something, so that we didn't run into that situation that Colby talked about where a positive effect and a negative effect kind of washed each other out and then nobody learns anything, right? So we really wanted apples to apples. And so this is where we go. So we have 10 group design studies and 7 single case design studies. And we actually had to analyze those separately. Again, a statistical thing that is not really relevant for, I think, this purpose today. But just know that really when we had to separate those out, our power to detect effect sizes became even smaller. So really, we were looking at 10 group design studies and saying, what was the mean effect of those 10 studies? And then 7 studies and saying, what was the mean effect of those 7 studies? And so that's kind of the world that we're living in here with this meta-analysis. And that certainly has implications for where we need to go with future research, which we'll talk about in a moment. So we can go to the next study, please. Okay, so our findings, and I know this has some sort of animation. So if you could click once, you'll see the combined reading outcomes, that effect size was 0.31. So if you think about, the effect size that Colby shared, the overall effect size was 0.33, right, for all students, and this was across 53 studies. Now we just take 10 studies and we got a very similar effect size. And so that's kind of just overall generally on reading outcomes. Then when we look, if you want to click just at word reading or non-word reading, and we did combine those again because of the few number of studies that we had. So this is when we're looking at real words or nonsense words, or if you call them pseudo words, the effect was a little bit bigger. Again, not surprising because these were by and large focused on building students' word reading skills or the skills that underlie them, like phonological awareness and decoding, things like that. So slightly larger effect size, still significant. That's what the little asterisk means. That means it was statistically significant. Also a statistically significant, which means, well, I think Caitlin's going to talk about that, but I always, like before I started my graduate program, I was almost embarrassed to admit that I didn't know what statistically significant meant. So I will just give a quick plug that it just means that you would not get that by chance, right? That like, there's something that you can kind of say, oh, this is because of this thing. And it's not just like you happen to flip the coin enough times. So oral reading fluency.
And just to jump in, I'm so sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah,
Karen, but I always feel like it's so important to say it's statistically significant, like just to know that usually we use this 0.05 level to figure out whether things are or aren't statistically significant, but just like maybe almost everything in life, right? There is a continuum, right? And so I think it's useful to know what 0.05 means. It just means like we can be 95, like our certainty is like we're 95% sure that this didn't happen by chance. I'm sure I described that terribly. But I think that if you look at the p-value column, you can get that information about like how sure can we really be. Whatever you read in that p-value column tells you, if you convert that into a percent, be like the percent chance that that you wouldn't actually find this result in the world.
Thank you.
Maybe that wasn't helpful.
No, it was, thank you. So we also got significant effects on oral reading fluency outcomes and on comprehension. Those were slightly smaller. But I think that what is equally important when we look at like findings of this meta-analysis in particular is what we didn't find is equally as important as what we did find. And I want to be really careful when you see that like the phonological awareness 0.28 doesn't have a little asterisk, that doesn't mean that okay, these interventions did nothing for kids' phonological awareness, and they were, you know, similarly for spelling, they did nothing for these kids' spelling because it wasn't statistically significant. Well, it was like bordering, it was like chasing statistically significant. It doesn't mean that. It just means that in this particular context, we didn't have enough studies to really be able, that included these components to really be able to confidently say that it did or it did not, okay?
And again, I'm going to jump in one more time. I just feel like this p-value thing is like, I'm feeling the need to talk more about it these days, but the, you know, you can see the p-value next to the phonological awareness effect size is 0.10. So it's like a little bit more than the ones that we counted as statistically significant. It wasn't under our 0.05 threshold, but it's just like a 10% chance that the result was due to chance here rather than like a 3% chance, right? So it's like a slightly elevated chance that it was due, that the 0.28 result was due to chance, but that's not a huge
and it wasn't negative. So like if you saw like a little negative sign in front of 0.28, then you might think that it actually had an adverse effect on students' phonological awareness. We don't see any negative effects, right? But we just can't say with a lot of confidence or with as much confidence that it really moved the needle on kids' phonological awareness in these 10 studies, right? That met these very stringent criteria. Yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to say about that, Colby or Caitlin? No? All right. We can go to the next slide. And comprehension. Yeah, go to the next slide. Okay. So just a couple of other things that I wanted to say about this before we pass it to Caitlin. I did want to say that, you know, when we talk about this issue of emergent bilinguals being under-identified for word reading difficulties, that is a really complex issue, and there are lots of sort of factors underlying why that is, and there are lots of different ways to sort of address that. But I did want to just kind of put out there that there is research that says when English learners or emergent bilinguals are identified, you know, at appropriate rates for dyslexia or for word reading difficulties, it does tend to be in schools in which there's a higher mean level of academic achievement, there's a higher mean level of socioeconomic status among the children who attend that school, and it's in schools with more resources, right? And so particularly if you work in a school where there are fewer resources, or the mean academic achievement of your students may be lower, or you know that you work with a lot of economically disadvantaged students and you have a lot of emergent bilinguals, I would really encourage you to talk to your administration and talk to your reading specialist, and, you know, talk to your ESOL teacher about what are the tools that are out there for assessing emergent bilinguals, specifically in the decoding side of the simple view, right? Because even though we were not powered enough to be able to look at, is it better to intervene earlier or later, like, you know, Colby was talking about, we know that it's better to intervene earlier, right? From lots and lots of research. We just weren't able to show it with this particular meta-analysis. And so if we're able to really identify those emergent bilinguals who have the risk factors for word reading difficulties, we identify them early and we can provide appropriate intervention, then we can help to remediate those word reading difficulties at the same time as they're building their oral language proficiency in English. So I just really wanted to put that plug in there, especially for those of you who may be practitioners. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet now and pass it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what does it all mean and synthesize the findings across the two reviews. So if we look at a side-by-side comparison across these two meta-analyses, if we're looking at the effect sizes by outcome type, we can see that the overall effect sizes are relatively similar, 0.33 and 0.31. We also see a similar pattern of results with larger effect sizes for word reading and with smaller effect sizes for text reading fluency and comprehension, which Colby already delved into a little bit of why that might be. And then additionally, only Hall's meta, Colby's meta, found a significant effect of interventions on phonological awareness outcomes, and it was larger than all other effect sizes at 0.40. And next slide. Okay, so if you don't have a background in statistics, or even if you do, it can be really difficult to put all this effect sized information into a context that's meaningful. So we're going to take you through 4 ways of considering these effect sizes that can be helpful when interpreting the results of these 2 metas. And I know Karen and Colby already talked about some of these things, but we're going to kind of go through it point by point. That way we make sure to cover all of our bases. And Colby, I think, yeah, just go to the next one. Thank you. And so in these meta-analyses, effect sizes are usually reported as Cohen's D or Hedges G. In our 2 metas, we report Hedges G, and these effect sizes are known as standardized mean difference effect sizes. And the important thing to know is that if you see an effect size of 1, that would mean that students in the treatment group could be expected to make gains that are 1 whole standard deviation greater than where they would be expected to be if they were getting what the comparison students were getting. And then statistical significance is another important thing to consider. So statistical significance gets at the level of certainty that we can have that this finding is a true finding or not due to chance, like Colby was telling us about. And we usually have a threshold of 0.05. And this means that there's only a 5% probability that the finding occurred due to chance. So all of the mean effect sizes we calculated for both reviews, except for, I think, a few that Karen showed us. My notes say 1, but I know there was more, were statistically significant. The one non-significant effect size was in the one Karen just talked about for the phonological awareness outcomes. And then we acknowledge that for an educator trying to put these pieces into these findings into practice, it can be really difficult to assess how practically meaningful a finding is, regardless of its statistical significance. So the next slide talks about using effect size guidelines to determine whether an effect size is small, medium, or large. And so traditionally, researchers use guidelines that were suggested in 1988 by Cohen that suggest that an effect size of 0.2 is small, an effect size of 0.5 is medium, and 0.8 is large. So by these guidelines, the effect size in our 2 metas are small. More recently, however, another researcher proposed a new set of guidelines. I think, Colby, if you click, we might get to see those ones. And under these guidelines, an effect size of 0.2 is large, not small, and an effect size of 0.5 is small. And everything in between is considered a medium effect. So that's also just not very helpful. And on the next slide, we'll talk about, oh, hold on. Nope. I think we're still on the last one. I'm sorry. I don't think we were ready to move on. It's more helpful just knowing whether an effect size is small, medium, or large, especially when there are conflicting guidelines like these that make it kind of difficult to make this decision or make this inference. So if we compare effect size estimates to growth that students make in a typical school year in the absence of intervention, then we can kind of explore this a little bit more. So Hill and colleagues analyzed data from 7 commonly used nationally normed assessments of reading and math achievement across K-12 students to estimate how much growth students make over the course of a typical school year in the absence of intervention. So when we looked at the reading test, we see that children in the earlier grades tend to make greater gains over the course of a year than children in upper grades. And in kindergarten and first grade, it's about 1.5 standard deviations, but by grades 4 and 5, it's less than 1/2 a standard deviation. And we're focusing on elementary school because K-5 is the grade range we explored in these 2 meta-analyses. So how do these estimates help us contextualize effect sizes in these 2 metas? Well, these estimates that we found in the Solari and Hall metas, 0.31 and 0.33, can be interpreted as indication that reading interventions with a foundational reading skills component resulted in between 3 and 8 months worth of additional growth beyond what would be expected in a typical year in the absence of intervention for students with at risk for dyslexia. And I think we're on the next slide. Lots of animations. Okay. So the last way we might think about the effect sizes reported in these 2 metas is to compare them with effect sizes reported in studies on the same topic within the same or similar population. So the metas that reported the effect size of 0.33 and 0.31 are similar in magnitude. What's been reported in previous meta-analyses that examine effects of interventions with struggling readers across K through 3 and in upper elementary school, as you can see here in table 2. So consistency in results across meta-analyses with similar populations illustrates 3 points. And so the first one is that multiple teams of researchers independently conducting meta-analyses and achieving similar results is a clear indication that findings are reliable or trustworthy. In other words, you consider these meta-analyses as a group and confidently conclude that reading interventions, especially those that include foundational skills and or decoding instruction, are effective for improving the reading outcomes of both EL and non-EL students with their risk reading difficulties, including dyslexia. And then the second thing is, of all these meta-analyses, these two were the only two to study the effects of reading interventions on outcomes for students identified as being at risk for word reading difficulties specifically, rather than at risk for a broader array of language or reading difficulties. And so that effect sizes were similar to those in other meta-analyses, which included studies that evaluated the effects of descriptively similar interventions for students with a broader range of difficulties, suggest that even students not identified with dyslexia may also struggle with word reading and spelling. And even students identified with general reading difficulties, therefore, are likely to benefit from interventions targeting these skills. And then I think the last one is that the effect sizes, oh, sorry, maybe there wasn't a click there, that effect sizes in these two meta-analyses were similar to one another, signals that interventions may be nearly equally effective for K5 ELs with or at risk for reading difficulties as for non-ELs with the same risk and improving reading outcomes, including both word reading and comprehension outcomes. Okay, I think that's it. And I think Karen is going to take it back from here.
Karen, you should do it. I can jump in if I need to. I think we were just going to move on to maybe a couple limitations or like fodder for discussion, and then then we should answer questions.
Sure. Across sort of, again, putting these two meta-analyses together, we identified some big areas where more research is needed. Again, I kind of like to think about not just what did we learn, but what do we not learn from these studies, right? Because no one study can be the be all end all, even a study that kind of synthesizes the results of many studies. And so first, we know from both meta-analyses that fewer studies included students with word reading difficulties and or dyslexia officially in grades 3 through 5 or upper elementary than did in K2. Only 8 of the 53 studies in the larger meta-analysis and only 3 of the 10 group design studies in the English learner meta-analysis. So we really want more rigorous research because, again, we only wanted experimental studies, right? So that's not to say that interventions aren't happening for these older elementary students. It's just to say that these really well-designed, rigorous studies have not been published as often as with older students as with younger students. So that's something that's a need. Again, I kind of talked about the underrepresentation of English learners with dyslexia kind of ad nauseum, but we know that we really do need a lot more, not only interventions and assessment of these students, but then we also need more research into what the effectiveness of those interventions is, because we only found out of those 53 studies, and remember that's out of 16,000 studies, we only found 10 that had that really rigorous design that included English learners with or at risk for dyslexia. And then we also know that we didn't really learn a whole lot about the different components of the intervention. Colby was able to really describe to you just like descriptively what these intervention components were. So many had a phonological awareness component and so many had, a vocabulary component. But what about ones that had all 5 of these, components, had morphology and vocabulary and comprehension and phonological awareness versus one that only focused on word reading and vocabulary? We kind of are lacking that sort of nuanced understanding of what is the sort of right combination of intervention components and in what sort of proportion. is most effective for, K2 learners with or at risk for dyslexia, for 3-5 emergent bilinguals for dyslexia. So we sort of still are chasing those more nuanced understandings. And we also know, again, from past research, but we were not able to really dive into this question in this meta-analysis just because of the number of studies. But we know that including first language supports, things like, support in a child's first language. So if you have a teacher who happens to speak the child's native language as well as the language of instruction, and is able to sort of provide that child some support in their native language in an intervention, we know that that is effective, but we weren't really able to dive into that question. What about using graphic organizers, visuals, gestures, all of these things, collaborative grouping, all of these things that individual studies have found to be quite effective for emergent bilinguals. We were not able to sort of pull them together and say, what is the mean effect of those things? Because we just didn't have the, the statistical power. But that's another direction that we really would like to go in the future, either us or, another research team. And then are there other, I know, things that maybe not on here, other things that Colby or Caitlin, you really want to answer, or that you think maybe was missing from these two different studies?
No, I think you described it well. I think, you did a good job since I changed some of the language on the slides at the end. But I think, I talked a little bit about how some of our analyses were underpowered, and I think really we're just saying here, if we get more research on these topics, we can better figure out really whether, adding morphology instruction to word reading instruction really helps, or whether, what exactly, as Karen said, what combination of components is most effective. We really kind of need more research out there in order to answer that question definitively. All right, should we jump to questions?
All right. Yeah. So we don't have questions in the Q&A right now, but I know a lot of the time what happens is folks are listening really intently. And as we open up the Q&A, questions start to occur to folks. But there was there was a nice conversation in the chat between Karen and a participant, but because there's different options for who do you send it to, it didn't actually reach to the participant. So Karen, the question from Mara, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, was, to clarify that 0.36 was teaching your English learners non-words. Their coworker and them are discussing nonsense words and whether to teach them or assess them. So you had a fantastic response to it, and I think a lot of people would benefit from it.
Sure. So yes, is it Mara?
Oh, I'm not sure. They're on. They're not
all on mute. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, I like to pronounce people's. Oh, yes, great, Mara. Thank you. So that was. I'm so glad you asked that question. The outcomes that we were showing you, the effect sizes that we were showing you, were for the outcomes that were measured in these studies, and not for the intervention components, right? So the 0.36 was the average effect size on non-word and word reading outcomes, not to say, like, regardless of what the intervention looked like, right? So for instance, if the intervention focused primarily on phonemic awareness and maybe did a little bit of decoding with real words, but then the assessment could have been maybe, the Dibble's nonsense word fluency. So it was on that outcome piece, not the intervention component piece. And then to address the second part of the question, and I'm sure Colby will have things to say about this as well, but just what I had tried to put in the chat was that I would say that instructionally, non-words or pseudo words, nonsense words, have a lot less value than using real words, and they have a lot less value instructionally than they do for assessment purposes. All right, because the reason that we like to use them for assessment purposes is because students can't memorize, a nonsense word, or we don't want them to be certainly we don't want to be having them memorize nonsense words. But that's why we use them in for assessment purposes, is because we're really able to see our students using their knowledge of sound spelling correspondences to be able to decode the word. And so that's why we can really get at it sometimes a little better with nonsense words when we assess test them. That is not to say that nonsense words have no place instructionally. I would just use them sparingly. So for instance, if you're doing, phoneme manipulation, right? And you say like, I'm going to say a very simple example. I'm going to take cat and I'm going to change the first phoneme. And I'm going to, change the k to a b. Then I'm going to get bat. And then I'm going to change it to a I'm going to get rat. I'm going to change it to a s. I'm going to get sat. And you do this, and you're doing it really quickly. It's okay to say, and if I change it to a z, what am I going to get? I'm going to get zap. That's not a word. It's not going to hurt them, right? It's not going to hurt them to write it down and see that on the board. It's fine for that kind of purpose. I wouldn't overdo it. And I certainly wouldn't make nonsense words sort of like a focus of instruction. So that's my 2 cents. And Colby, what would you add or clarify in that?
I really think I agree with everything you said, every word. So I have nothing to add, which is rare.
Also there, and I'll just also add one other thing to that. I mean, I also fully agree with everything that you said. You summed it up really nicely. There are a number of evidence-based decoding word reading programs that have a lot of different kind of similarities to them. Lots of them, you'll see something, like a blending drill or a visual drill where kids are systematically manipulating one grapheme in a word. And so all the advice that you get in these training programs on the curricula is that, if you change a vowel and you get the word zet, no big deal, not a big deal at all, whether it's pure phoneme or whether you're using letters to teach. But right, you don't want it to be the majority of your instruction by any means. All right, let's see. So still don't have any questions in the Q&A. So let's see. If no one else has any questions, I want to open it back up for any kind of any closing remarks. We do have one. Does the article we linked in the session have information about the specific interventions that were used?
Yes, it does. And we were actually interviewed for a Heschinger report story. And so I kind of reached out to some people who were authors of interventions and listed some in that report. So I even have some of them. I know Jess Tost has an intervention that she has worked to make available online that was tested in our meta and was associated with positive effects. There are others.
It's called Word Connections.
Okay, good for you for remembering that. There's a Sharon Vaughn intervention called Proactive Reading. Gosh, there are others too. I'm actually not remembering them now, but it is available in that paper. There's, the intervention name is, part of a table that describes each intervention and the effects that it was associated with.
Excellent. We appreciate that. There was another question in the chat. Yes, the recordings will be provided here. We also put this up for free on our YouTube page. So if you go to, throw a quick shameless plug here, the Reading League Florida has a YouTube page. If you just go to YouTube and type in the Reading League Florida, you could find all of our previous sessions here. There was another question here in the chat. If you'd like to say a little bit more specifically about the dosage in the studies that you looked at. I did post a little link to a quick little thing from the National Center on Intensive Intervention in the chat on what's called their intensive intervention hierarchy. But if you could talk a little bit about dosage.
Yes, it's such a good question. And, this question was asked the last time I presented on this topic. And so I should have the answer in my mind, because I think the only really useful information that I can provide to answer that is kind of the mean dosage and the standard deviation across all the studies that we included. For some reason in my mind, I have 30 point something hours as the mean dosage, but I'm probably wrong. Caitlin, I think I asked you mid-presentation last time to look up our mean dosage and the standard deviation, but I don't know if there's time to ask you to look it up right now. I can get you that information later. But I do think that that information is also available, hopefully, in our table in the paper. And I do think it's a good question. I think there was a lot of variability across our studies, if I'm just like speaking from memory right now.
I have it up. Jesse, am I able to share I have the chart up from that meta? Am I able to share my screen?
You should be able to share your screen, yeah.
Okay, so that is right here. Can you all see that? So here's the dosage, and this is in hours, is that right?
Yeah.
So this, and again, there's 53 studies, and these are the different interventions, but you can see that wide variability that Colby was just talking about.
Yeah, so hopefully this is helpful. And I don't know if we provide the mean and the standard deviation in the article, but if anyone's interested, I can let you know that. But maybe just looking at the dosage for these individual studies is useful.
Oh yeah, it goes on and on. Yeah, I don't think it's here. So yeah, it varies widely. 9 hours, so yeah.
I could piggyback on that question, not to put you all on the spot or anything, but you know, we often talk about, and rightly so, dosage in terms of number of lessons, amount of time per day. Do you have thoughts about things like opportunities to respond and receive corrective feedback as dosage in an intervention?
I mean, I definitely have ideas that are not related to the studies that we did, because we didn't, you know, it's rare, if not just unheard of, for a study to provide information in enough detail about the way their intervention was to code for things like opportunities to respond. I wish we did that more in observation studies. So, you know, in observation studies, we, you know, take an observation of classroom instruction, ideally like many hours of recorded classroom instruction, and we can code for any variables we want to and look to see if those variables that we code for are associated with student gains. Like ideally, we can measure students at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, and then code their teacher's instruction and see, oh, are certain teacher practices associated with more growth across the school year. And I would love to see more observation studies that code for opportunities to respond, because I have a feeling that, you know, teachers who provide more opportunities to respond, their kids are going to grow more during the school year. But you don't see people coding for that variable often enough, I think. So I think it's a really good question. I think it should be studied more. And it definitely, unfortunately, just the way that the methods we have to use, we just really rely on how researchers describe their interventions in these articles. And they usually get like only a short paragraph or two to describe the intervention. And they won't describe an approach to opportunities to respond, usually.
Yeah, it seems like one of those things that is, I mean, it just makes a lot of logical sense, and it rests on really solid theoretical ground, but it seems like it's a really challenging thing to provide a really solid quantitative study on, just because of all the limitations you're talking about. But
just to bring it back to dosage, you're so right that dosage is sort of a clunky tool almost to, you know, just talking about hours of intervention. You know, doesn't really get at how much students are getting, right? Like how teachers are using those precious minutes in each hour. So I do think it's a good point that dosage doesn't tell us everything. And I think I think I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
There's another question. A couple of the questions are about specific curricula. One of the persons said that they noticed EdMark was on the intervention list. And I know you noted that there was a small percentage, maybe 1 or 2 intervention studies that didn't teach word reading decoding. Was EdMark the one that was more of like the word memorization?
You know, if Karen shows me the list again, I feel like I remember the author of the study where the reading was just like rote word reading. They didn't teach students how to decode. Yes, that's the one. Mayfield. EdMark is the one where it was just rote word reading.
There you go. Perfect. All right. Oh, there's another Q&A here. All right. So that's the last one. Okay. So that's it for the questions here. And it's 6:25. We have our 6:30 end mark. So I think that is a good place to end this here. I want to thank you again, Colby, Karen, and Caitlin. We so appreciate your time to take on a Wednesday evening after what I'm sure was a long day of work. We appreciate everyone who attended here live, spending your very hard weekday time learning about dyslexia and meta-analyses and these things that I think are just so important to be to have a strong understanding of research. So thank you so much, and we so appreciate it again.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right.
All right, take care.